How do applications for political asylum in the United States work in practice? Why is the US asylum system described as a broken system? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute's interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Basileus Zeno, a Syrian scholar and political refugee in the United States. Basileus Zeno is a visiting lecturer in political science at Amherst College in Massachusetts, specializing in comparative politics and contemporary political theory. An archaeologist by training who was born and raised in Syria, he arrived in the United States in 2012. Fearing imprisonment or worse if he returned, Zeno the following year applied to the US government for political asylum. Earlier this month, he recounted this experience in a Washington Post opinion piece entitled, "Trump May Be Gone, but the US asylum system is still broken." Basileus Zeno, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections. I'd like to begin by asking you about your personal experience. How did you end up in the United States? For those of us unfamiliar with the US asylum process, how does it work? What are applicants required to do? Can they access support navigating the labyrinth of US bureaucracy?
Hi, Mouin. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about this issue, especially in the light of what's going on around Afghanistan and the debate. So I came here a long time ago. I came here, I landed on August 2012, and I came with my wife. So I had a visa to come to before that I was doing my PhD in archaeology in Syria. And also I was an active participant in the Arab Spring, which was also unfolding in Syria. I was living in Damascus. Then after July 2012, which is, if you recall, the so-called the assassination of senior officers in the Syrian army, and then that was the turning point, one of the many turning points in the context of the Syrian uprising. So I fled, and I already had a visa as a J2 scholar because my wife got a scholarship, and we came here together. So things weren't clear at all where the situation would be going, So then I sought asylum after a few months since I arrived into the United States.
Mm-hmm. And how does the process work exactly?
So most people knew about asylum after in 2013, 14, 15, right? In 2012, I even didn't know what asylum is. I never heard of the word. I knew about basically Palestinian refugees in Syria and in neighboring countries, and also Iraqi refugees, where I had encounter with them in Damascus. But I didn't know how the process would work, how you can end up as a refugee, or what's the meaning of refugee, all of that. So I learned that the difficult way. So we have here to distinguish between two processes, or even three, that are, I think, to make it clear. A refugee, like anyone who is being resettled in the United States, as around the debate around Afghanistan, Iraq in the past, would go through a very lengthy process of vetting and multiple interviews, and the process will take between 1 year to up to 5 years. It depends where you are living, in camps or other. But first you have to be registered with the UNHCR, and then they will identify
the United Nations Refugee Agency. Yes.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then they will agree with one of the major resettlement agencies in the United States, and then they will be flying with the approval of the State Department and others, and relocated in one of the hosting locations in the United States. So for asylum seekers, it's a different process.
And you, I'm sorry, you were already in the United States when you...
I was already in the United States. So to seek asylum, you have to be on the American soil. You have to arrive to make the trip here.
So there isn't a process that... Sorry, you can't apply for asylum in the United States if you're not in the country.
Yeah. So let's say, because I receive this question frequently from Syrians who want to leave and others. And so there isn't such a process that go to the American embassy, let's say in Beirut, and file your application. It doesn't exist. Or actually take shelter in the embassy. It doesn't exist this way. So you have to be here. But there are two processes here, one called affirmative and one called defensive. Affirmative is like my case, when I had a valid visa and you apply for asylum and you go through the USCIS, United States of Immigration, and which is under the Department of Homeland Security.
The Immigration Service.
Yeah, the Immigration Service. So under the defensive is mostly those who are coming through the southern borders. So they try to come through us and apply for asylum there. And then the majority of them would be detained by the CPP and the Department of Homeland Security. And we know that's the most visible issue on the southern border. First, because of the number of people who are coming. And second, because of the brutality that was manifested under Trump, in particular, caging kids and others. Affirmative is more hidden, more subtle, lengthy, slow, and mostly invisible, and in many aspects authoritarian, which I can basically explicate more during the conversation.
And where did you go? You go to the US CSIS to apply?
Yeah.
Do you go to the... And were you able to get legal assistance? Were there organizations or individuals who were able to guide you through this process, or were you on your own?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually, because it's at first you have to file an application called, everyone has to file an application called I-589, which is application for asylum and for withholding of removal. And you have, it's not a requirement, but it will increase your chances of actually having a strong case and not fell in the trap of being manipulated by asylum officers. Because actually, through experience, through multiple interviews, and I can talk later that I did my field work around the same topic. So it's the point seems in the United States is actually to find any even typos, like to deter you from becoming a refugee or an asylee. When you are granted, you will be called an asylee in the United States rather than actually accepting your case. So they are finding any way to deny your case rather than any way actually to be convinced with the strength of your case. So I will emphasize here 3 points. One is the application filing within 1 calendar year. And also setting the deadline is part of the
within 1 year of your arrival on US soil.
Of your arrival, yeah.
And if you don't file within that year, you're ineligible to apply.
Ineligible. So it used to be, you could have done exemption through actually lengthy process explaining why you didn't file asylum, why. For instance, like many people were already in the United States when the Arab Spring unfolded, right? So they didn't land in the United States within 1 year, but actually they were here for a long time. So they had to make a case why they have been living in the United States for 3-4 years and didn't seek asylum. So this is why, however, Trump proposed actually denying anyone who didn't file within 1 year, like before, it's called death to asylum. So I'm not going to go through details because there are many nuances here. But so one is filing application within the 1 calendar year, finding a good lawyer, and actually having a strong case. However, none of these are guaranteed that your case will be approved. My case is one example that we can talk later about.
Sure.
However, I didn't have any access to any like agency or pro bono lawyers or anything, because when we first arrived, we were in Athens, Ohio, where my wife was doing her master's at Ohio University. So we didn't have any basically support group around us, no pro bono, nothing. So I had to work for almost a year, 7 months at Chipotle to save money actually to be able to afford the cost of paying for an attorney. That wasn't the case though in metropolitan Sydney. During my field work, I interviewed many asylum seekers who were granted asylum. Some of them came after me, but actually they had support through Human Rights First, for instance, through CARE as institutions. So they found and many pro bono attorneys who are more readily available in areas like Washington, D.C., Virginia, and California.
So location also matters.
Oh yeah, matter a lot, yeah. Including in terms of approval rate of asylum cases, which is something else that is indicator of how the asylum work is really, it's not completely about your own case.
So in your Washington opinion piece, you wrote that in May of this year, you received a rejection notice that was, in your words, and I'm quoting, Kafkaesque, riddled with contradictions and outright falsehoods, end quote. Why did it take 8 years for your application to be processed? And why did you offer this assessment of your application's rejection?
I think this is a very important question. My assessment is based on two aspects. One is my direct first-hand experience with the asylum system. And second is extensive field work with asylum seekers across the country. Not just so I conducted my field work in Massachusetts, in Washington, D.C., and in California, and also interviews with asylum seekers in Michigan, including actually multiple interviews with immigration attorneys. So to get the perspective of experts as well as the lived experience of asylum seekers. So why I did this assessment. So just to, I had very limited word count, so you can't fit the whole story. So the whole story is that I had my first asylum interview 4 years after I filed my asylum application.
So in 2017.
2017, immediately after Trump became as the president. So my body, my soul, my family immediately lived the impact of his brutality because of the adversarial setting that was imposed on us. So the first interview was in 2017, in March 2017 in Boston. Then I will give you, I will answer the Kafkaesque part through
Please
this.
do.
And then so they tried to frame me as a terrorist. So that's the thing. It didn't work out because I had nothing to do. I was actually one of the few voices in Syria who advocated for a peaceful transition and was against militarization and the emergence of the Free Syrian Army, which is different from civil, self-defense. I was against this kind of escalation. So it didn't fit with them. So they tried to frame a normal taxi driver who drove me to Beirut as he could be like a terrorist. So which means I found out later there is a clause that was imposed by Bush, which called material support of terrorism. So basically, let's say Mouin and I are in a taxi, and then one of the taxi driver was detained later. I gave him water or anything.
Or you paid for the ride.
Yeah, you paid for the ride. So that could be considered as material support of terrorism. So which is nothing about your case, nothing about us, but it's a system that I'm not going to use jargon, but I found actually Agamben got it in a way that is inclusion through exclusion. So they will actually, it's part of maintaining white supremacy and racialization through the lack of transparency, the lack of rights, the reduction of human beings who are coming from the global south into a mere subhuman waiting for the approval of the gatekeeper to let you in. And it's not about your case, so I would reflect more about why is that. So then the asylum officer didn't give us a decision, not 6 months, not a year. And then so I used many circles of connection to impose certain power and leverage. I placed over the last 7-8 years, 21 congressional inquiries. So if people think, oh, he doesn't follow up. So sometimes they were citing national security and public safety. Sometimes they say they found inconsistency. Sometimes they say, oh, it's under supervisory. So all these generic responses that doesn't give you anything.
And you felt your application was being dealt with in a way to find a pretext for its rejection. Is that how I should understand it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that will become more documented and clear when you read actually the notice of intent of denial. and then I will have a couple of comments on that in particular. So the asylum officer didn't make a decision. Then after really pressure, they brought us for a second interview, like a year and a half after that, which was in October 2018. And we spent 5 hours each time, but this time actually wasn't about anything about the first asylum interview. It was mostly the most culturally prejudiced and ignored question we ever received in our life. Like, why my name is my name? 15 minutes to explain that. What's the difference between Greek Orthodox and Rome Orthodox? Can you explain this difference? Like questions that you wouldn't expect, actually, that's part of the asylum. Or like about language, about like nothing, like literally. And then can you tell us how did you apply for your own passport, and in detail, like what is the conversation that took place 7 years ago, and etc. And then they disappeared again. So multiple inquiries, no response whatsoever. So we had to file something, the only legal way to force the USCIS to make a decision or take an action is something costly, which is also about racial capitalism and how the system actually is live off of your own surplus work. Like I work, I save money, and then I have to spend it on this system to sustain it, to allow the system to torture me and others over and over and over. That's the irony of the system. So we had to file a threat of a writ of mandamus, which means like a lawsuit. We sent that on November 4, 2020. So around the election time. So within a few weeks, they responded. They said they aren't going to make a decision. They want to bring us for a third interview. It was, if you remember, it's the surge of the pandemic in the whole area, and everyone must be quarantined. So my lawyer called them. She was in Michigan. And she said like she cannot come because she had to quarantine in when she arrived. So basically she can't make it. And there were instructions that we can do the interview at least like
by video,
or anything that will maintain this basically safety and everything. We told them also like I have a baby girl. I can't risk the life of my baby. Like she cannot be vaccinated. She is only barely one year old. And they said like basically we must all come, or basically I will be either denied or I can reschedule. So basically it's on me. The system is on me again. We had to go, and we had to find an attorney within 10 years. 10 days. Another attorney who should be basically familiar with your case, work with you. So we went there, and guess what? They didn't allow my wife and my daughter to come in. So it's basically just a show of cruelty. And we occupied the 3 different rooms. One, I was in one, the attorney was in one, and the asylum officer was in one. We spent 2 hours, and none of the questions basically were about the first or the second or any inconsistency. Is basically, from reading the notice of denial, she was reading what was already prepared as a denial letter, but in the frame of a question.
So this wasn't an interview, this was basically notification of denial.
Yeah, but in the frame of interview. So how I knew as an ethnographer, political scientist who is doing political ethnography, I took careful note, like immediately after that, like field note. And I found like it's starking, like identical to, like they were verbatim sentences in the notice of denial that were asked during the asylum interview. And my attorney had to intervene because the officer was trying to force me to change my story that I told her about what happened 10 years ago. So she told him, what you are trying to do? I told her, like, basically you are trying to push me to change my story, which was actually very well documented, and ask me about traumatizing experience, about what I did 10 years ago. And then you want to force me to change my story, to go to your supervisor and tell him, hey, we found the inconsistency. Let's deny his case. And that's what happened. So that's what happened exactly.
And then you were notified of the rejection a few months later.
Yeah, so right when the new head of Mauritius, the new head of the DHS was appointed, like the day after we received a notification through the USCIS website that a decision was made. So we didn't expect a denial at all because the case is really well documented. And yeah, it was one of the most horrible experience, the most torturous experience that I ever had since I left Syria. The one comment about why I'm being denied is they cited having a Syrian passport. I did even screenshot, but so they said I have a Syrian passport issued in November 2012, which is wrong. It's in 2011. So they cited just because I entered the country legally with my passport, which was issued 10 years ago and not renewed and expired, as a reason to deny my asylum. Then they said, I failed to prove the Moghrabi test, which is basically four-pronged. I'm not going to go through detail, but basically I failed to prove that the Syrian regime has the capability and the intention to basically attack activists so basically the burden of proving the crimes of the Syrian regime is on me, coming from the very same government that issued the worst sanctions on people and the government at the same time. And they keep repeating, protecting human rights, we are imposing more sanctions, more sanctions. And another ironical thing is the USCIS and Department of Homeland Security decided that to redesignate the TPS, temporary protection status, for Syrians because it's not a safe country for civilians. In the notice of intent of Jadaliyya, and the final letter, they said, there is no question, you are an activist, no question, you continue your anti-government statements and lectures. And however, and that's the Kafka's part, the Syrian government didn't try to harm me or contact me while I'm here in the United States. So they
didn't send a death squad or
And it's to build on this. If you know, remember, there's a travel ban on Syrians, right? So basically, no Syrian can get a visa to come here, but they expect a security forces agent have to apply for a visa, learn English, apply for a visa, land a flight, and tell the officer, I'm going to persecute or harm Basileus Zeno, who is living in Amherst. Could you give me a ride? Then he will come persecute me and then travel. It's a word that doesn't exist, but they have it in writing.
And what has happened since you received your notice of rejection?
So you will be, and that's one of the unique situations. The overwhelming majority who will be denied asylum will be referred to the court. They will have a second chance. In my case, because I was doing my PhD, so I was in a valid F1 status, I had to receive a notice of intent of denial, or NOID. When we received this, we had 16 days, actually, in fact, it's 10 days, but 16 days to respond in a legal report. We collected new evidence. I submitted a new statement, 10 pages, single space. My attorney responded to all the factual mistakes that they had, cited court decisions that basically refute their claims. And we submitted 2 testimonies from top scholars. One is, and I appreciate their efforts, Lisa Wadeen and Stephen Heidman. Both of them actually, they attested to the veracity of what I said and wrote actually a testimony to support my claim on the one hand, and actually to correct some of the mistakes that were cited in the country conditions report. Also, we submitted a letter of support from senators like Senator Murky, Moulton, and others in support of my application. Nevertheless, we on May 10th, we received a final denial insisting that basically, since I wasn't contacted by the Syrian government, or they didn't harm me here abroad, so basically I'm not eligible for asylum.
And there's no further possibility of appeal or reconsideration?
No, and that's the thing that I think when you have other questions about like challenges, it's beyond my case. It's something more systemic and more structural, where you are living under an authoritarian regime. Like basically, I never left authoritarianism. So I had another form of authoritarianism, but here it's because you have no rights.
But that takes me to my next question, because in your Washington Post article, you characterize the U.S. asylum system as, in your words, broken. Your own application, as you've just indicated, spanned 3 U.S. administrations: Obama, Trump, and now Biden. So is it your view that Trump broke the system and Biden has been slow or unwilling to fix it? Or are there more serious structural issues that go beyond the particular agenda of the politicians in power?
Yeah, that's a very important question as well, because I saw some reactions to my op-ed by basically maybe supporters of Trump or curious people, let's say, like you applied for asylum under Obama, got denied under Biden. So what Trump had to do with any of that? So that's the thing, that people are fixated on administration, but not the how the system fundamentally changed under Trump. It was horrible, unjust before, but it's not just unjust for asylum seekers, but also for officers actually who want to abide by the law, who would actually
those
apply
who process
asylum
the applications.
Yeah. So sometimes they are pressured, and this came through some of my fieldwork interviews. Some felt they are pressured by their supervisor or the director of ex-asylum office to actually deny as many cases as possible. Some actually
sorry,
have their...
when you say that, Basit, is this something that became evident during the Trump years, or has that always been the case?
No, that's good thing. Actually, this is attested by also data statistics. There is a lawsuit by the ACLU Maine, because they found out that the majority of Black asylum seekers actually had their asylum application denied by the Boston Asylum Office. So there isn't any available data for the affirmative asylum cases, but there is a website called the Track that basically file FOIA and traces the denial
Freedom
and
of Information Acts.
Based on defensive asylum cases and those who are reviewed by the court. With the affirmative, is very difficult to get any information because they are very protected, and there is no review of the process. You have no right to access the notes, or the public, or even your lawyer, the notes, how they adjudicated the X case or Y case. To respond to your question, so the system is broken by design. And there is little interest in fixing, and this is relevant to the question of cruelty against racialized others in immigration. Like if I and a French or British applicant applied for the same thing, like this, the system within it has an apartheid system within the US. So your application from someone from the Middle East will be adjudicated in a lengthy process because you are predefined as either a terrorist or a threat to the national security of the country, or if you are from Latin America or Central America, you have a bogus claim or a liar or a criminal, or like basically they have categories they want to impose on this. But to go a little bit back, so the United States had a very long history that I'm not going to go through that, like the Chinese Exclusionary Act, the National Origin Act. But in 1980, under the Carter administration, there was a change, which was basically the Refugee Act. Reagan, however, who came into power in January 1981, was supporting the fascist government of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. So how that played out,
Honduras,
that was an interesting.
not Nicaragua.
So basically, so they denied asylum claim because these people were fleeing from brutality and war crimes against humanity by the very same government supported by the United States. So they fled to the United States, go through Mexico, and then when they filed for asylum, the overwhelming majority were denied. As far as I remember, I think I have a statistic here, the approval rate for Salvadoran and Guatemalan asylum cases were under 3% in 1984. Why I'm raising that? Because when you compare that with the statistics from the Boston Asylum Office, which dropped actually from around 40% in December 2016 to suddenly around less than 8% in
So that's
December.
the Trump effect.
Yeah, that's the Trump effect. Yeah, because they definitely there are different, let's say hypothetically, there are policy memos or secret directives that are inaccessible and cannot be accessed even if you are filing for FOIA. Like I did the FOIA, by the way, I got the results.
The Freedom of Information Act, yeah.
Yeah.
So
they didn't give me anything substantive, yeah.
Right. But I mean, this raises, I think, also another broader question. I mean, if we look at your personal experience, you've now been in the United States for 9 years. Yeah. You're fluent in English. You're an academic with a position at a prestigious university. The government of Syria is considered illegitimate by Washington, not an ally like El Salvador or Honduras was in the 1980s. And you can plead your case in the pages of the Washington Post. And so I think the question is, if this is the outcome of your case, what does this tell us about the fate of so many others who encounter the US asylum system without any of the advantages and privileges that you have had? What needs to change?
Yeah. Thank you so much for this question. That's great. So that's the point actually why I published that piece in the op-ed, which is making me more vulnerable, right? Like there is no change. I know there is no change. I didn't write that because I had any belief that basically there would be sudden structural change that will change the outcome, or the officer would be reviewed, or I will be having like a fair process. No, I wrote that actually to show that the system is far from adjudicating cases based on the merit of these cases, which is a narrative that is embraced by not just the Trump administration, but also many liberals who would say, oh, the system needs reforms. Actually, you don't need reform. You need like fundamental restructuring, rebuilding the whole system. And there are, for instance, many secret programs. For instance, something called Karl, is the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program, which specifically target applicants from the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and Muslim applicants, Arab applicants. And this gives power, for instance, for asylum officers and their supervisors to withhold cases in limbo forever. Nothing can compel them actually to make a decision. And how we knew about this secret memo, which was imposed illegally by the Bush administration without the approval of the Congress, is through a class action lawsuits by the ACLU, like under the Obama. So it took many years to know what's going on. Why this case, X case? Did my case, for instance, was withheld like illegally before the writ of mandamus, like because of Karl? I don't know. That's the thing. You don't know. But you see, like people having their cases are delayed even after the interview, if they are applying for a green card or even citizenship. So it's not just about asylum, it's about
immigration more generally.
Yeah, because in this way, they create also a collective punishment. Because we are fixated on the individual cases. But in fact, not just me or not just other asylum seekers, the whole families or relatives and friends of the applicant would be collectively punished. I didn't see my family in a decade. And now I had to start, I think about where I can find home in another country with the possibility of seeing my family one day. I had a baby who didn't meet her grandparents because of both like the Syrian government policy, but at the same time, the racialized politics of the United States, which is what I call illegal violence at the same time. So I'm raising these issues and sharing this, like I'm being more transparent than the asylum office itself. I have nothing to hide. Like if I didn't have a strong case, I'm not going to make myself actually visible to everyone else and accessible at the same time. But I want this office to have transparency and others similar to what asylum officer had to. And something in most cases is about credible fear, right? And credibility. And it's in most cases like the people have state-centric view and question the credibility of refugees and asylum seekers, but it's not the other way around. What is about the credibility of asylum officer? What is about the credibility of Trump himself, or basically Stephen Miller? Like Stephen Miller explicitly embraced like white supremacy. Would I trust this person actually to restructure the whole system and believe that he has more credibility than asylum seekers? I tend to not believe that.
So looking at it now in more current and general terms, of course, about 5 years ago, the Syrian refugee crisis very much dominated the global headlines. And now, as you mentioned earlier, we have the crisis in Afghanistan, which has once again reignited the immigration debate in terms of both questions of asylum and refugee admissions. What are your thoughts on this issue and what it tells us about the U.S. immigration system? For example, we've seen reports of people who served in the Trump administration saying that part of the problem is that Stephen Miller specifically shut down the whole application process for Afghans to be able to apply for, I think they're called special immigration visas during the past several years. And that's one of the issues that has contributed to the current crisis that we're seeing at Kabul airport.
Yeah. So it's first, I want to express my solidarity with the Afghani asylum seekers and refugees around the world who are going through this uncertainty, which is in larger aspect is the result of American imperialist war on both Afghanistan and Iraq, and actually waging war against people of color. And because even the debate here is fixated on how many about the budget, how many billions of dollars that were spent there, and how many American soldiers were killed there, but nothing about actually the people who were directly affected by this war, like replace Taliban with the Taliban itself. So this is relevant also to the challenges that the US itself imposed on the processes of adjudicating cases and resettling refugees in the United States, which we started with, right? The difference between asylum seekers and refugees. So the process, because they had to review every single application between like 1 year to 18 months to 5 years, it depends, before being resettled here, which means a clearance from the FBI, CIA, and all the other security-related department before being able to be resettled here. So they created a lengthy process. This is why there are some calls why not actually resettle them in a third safe country, and then we can try to adjudicate their cases. I think that actually to deflect the responsibility of the United States in all this horrendous situation where Afghan basically found themselves alone and isolated with that. And also I want to emphasize something else here, that the cost of the destruction of Afghanistan exceeded 2 decades before, because it started with the Soviet, because including actually the US did something, a few people are talking about that, but they printed out school curriculum that were introduced to refugees and especially children with the money matched actually by Saudi Arabia at the time, to impose Islamist content that encouraged violence and actually erase anything about secular education. So basically they weaponized children for more than 10 years. That was taxpayer money. So the responsibility is not just a couple of decades, it exceeds more than that. Which is violation to the UNICEF, violation to children's rights and others. What should be done is basically the US and policymakers should take responsibility, should be expediting the process of resettling refugees, not just from Afghanistan, eliminate many of the restrictions that are absurd, Kafkaesque in its nature. For instance, if someone is fleeing, you cannot ask him why you don't have X document or Y document if he's fleeing and his house is burned and destroyed. Like, it's not a job application, it's an asylum application. But here they treat it as if you are applying for the perfect job application. The second thing is make the asylum process for those asylum seekers from Afghanistan here and others very transparent. Make it transparent. If there is an interview, during the interview, the attorney should have access to the transcript and the notes of the officer. If you have nothing to hide, make it actually transparent. That's the thing. You can't make up lies for, and this is another thing. The Boston office claimed that I'm currently an employee with the Syrian government, and they say it's fact. And that's like, it's not, it doesn't need actually any like, I'm an employee with the I was an employee with the UMass Amherst as a PhD student, and was teaching, and so I had nothing to do with the Syrian government for a decade, and the only work that I did was at a museum for 3 months to document artifacts. That's it, and that's not. So they said like, I'm currently like working with the Syrian government. So how to fix this when someone actually making up lies and actually making up excuses? So the same applies to asylum seekers and refugees from Afghanistan. The US should be held accountable to the damage that it did to all these countries, but also to the people who are seeking refuge in the United States, from the United States, and from its allies as well.
Finally, Basileus, what's next for you?
I think that's the most difficult question. The thing about asylum is it eliminates the sense of future from your existence, from your human condition. So where do you see yourself 5 years from now? I have no question. I have no country. I cannot go back to Syria. The US decided to deny my asylum. My position is temporary. So basically in a year, I don't know where I will end up, or whether I will find home one day in another country. That's a big question. But that's another question that we all, as refugees and asylum seekers, we share. The question of the future, being deprived from having a sense of certainty in life, it's part of the cruelty of the process itself. It's to inflict maximum slow pain that will crawl over your body and soul until actually get into you. But hopefully, and that's to conclude with this, I feel I'm responsible. I will use my academic work to advocate for the case of asylum seekers, to make sure that justice would be served in the United States and all other countries, that refugees and asylum seekers is not actually an identity that you are born with or you embrace. It's the conditions that create so I'm not ashamed of being a refugee in this world. I'm ashamed of the conditions that produce and sustain my refuginess in the world. That's the thing that need to be fixed before actually having any debate about refugees and asylum seekers. And thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, Basileus Zeno, thank you very much for sharing your views and insights on connections, and wish you the very best as your case continues.
Thank you, Mouin, and thank you for addressing this timely issue. And I wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.